All of these dives usually begin pretty much the same. We're all crowded onto a boat. When we finally stop and we've arrived at our destination, we scramble to put our gear on, do all the last-minute checks, make sure everything's working properly, and then jump into the water as soon as we possibly can to get rid of the heat that's around us. When you're wearing a wetsuit and you're on a boat deck, it's not a fun experience if everything else is dried out. It's very sweltering. But even once you're in the water, you're there with a whole bunch of other people, at least for a little while. But of course, that's not why you came. Most of us came because we're there to be a little closer to nature, to see the beauty that's around us, and sometimes, if we're really lucky, maybe to see something we've never even seen before. Eventually, though, you get moving. You let the air out of your buoyancy compensator, you move down the lines, and you start to move toward the whole reason that you came out here that day. Of course, you're not always alone even then. This reef that we came to, it's an artificial reef. It's called Barracuda Alley. And there's a good reason for that. There's a number of them around. But they're not really the reason why I came today. Barracuda are pretty common out here. We were told ahead of time that the water conditions wouldn't be terribly clear because there was a tremendous amount of plankton and phytoplankton blooming in the area. And they were right. When we got there, it was actually a bit like pea soup. But that opens up opportunities to see things that feed on that plankton. And so as we started to descend the anchor line, it was with great anticipation that maybe we'd get to see some things in larger numbers than are normally present when the water is all clear and it's perfect for taking pictures. The further down we went and the closer we got to the bottom, the more the anticipation built until we could actually finally see the deck of the barge that had been sunk as part of this artificial reef. When we first saw it, it just seemed like a murky mess. There wasn't too much really to it. There was a lot of seaweed floating around. But then, all of a sudden, they came into view. Clouds of these small fish that normally you see in smaller numbers, but now it was just tremendous. Hundreds and hundreds of them around us. And so we began to make our way over the rest of the hulk that was in front of us and try to find even newer things to observe. The wreck didn't disappoint, incidentally. It didn't take us more than, maybe 100 or so feet of movement, and we began to encounter even larger clouds, almost like shoals of these small fish. And with them were the usual species that we were used to seeing on wrecks. Juvenile black drum, jacks, the usual damselfish, and of course the soft corals and anemones. But when you looked out from all that into the expanse of water, these shoals of fish were in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions. And they moved in just this amazing synchronization at times. You've got to wonder how they managed to coordinate all of that. But eventually the question finally occurs to you. What's causing all the movement? Why is it that they're moving in such synchronization? And the answer, of course, is there's usually something behind them, driving them onward, some predatory fish. I had hoped to be able to get footage of that on this trip, but unfortunately, the predators didn't reveal themselves to us. That was okay. Just being there, being able to see this expanse of these smaller fish was breathtaking enough. Eventually, we started to make our way around the back side of the hull of the barge that had been sunk. And even under it, we were able to find traces of life. Some of these small fish that had made their way down there, just to seek a bit of shelter, as well as some of the usual residents. At this depth, which is about 65 feet or so, one of the first casualties is color. Reds and yellows go away almost immediately as you move down through the water column. So the only way to really be able to see some of that is to bring light with you. On the camera that I'm using in this video today, I actually have a couple of underwater lights, and so we're able to actually pick up the colors from the soft corals, but even see these small damselfish, which I always appreciate because of the variety that they come in. It's worth it to have that kind of gear just to be able to bring back some of these little visual treasures. This jack that you see in the frame just now, it's one of the fish that's fairly popular at the local restaurants. And it's always ironic to me when we're on these dives to be able to meet up with what is normally an entree and actually get to see it in its environment and in its natural state. I doubt that it's any more enthusiastic, though, in terms of seeing us than it would be meeting us at the restaurant. These juvenile black drum are something that you see on these wrecks all the time. Sometimes they come in very large schools. At first their colors seem a little bit plain, but when you see them up close and the light hits them, there is actually a beauty to them. There's almost an iridescence on the scales. We made our way aft toward the back of the barge. One of the things that we were hoping to see was more in the way of coral growth, and we weren't disappointed. There actually was significantly more of it. The reason we wanted to see that, number one, is the coral itself is beautiful, but it also usually means that it's home to some other species that you wouldn't get to see without significant growth around it, simply because it's part of their food. This fellow is one of the key examples. Now, he's actually an oyster toad. He doesn't look like much at first, although in his own way, he's actually kind of pretty. But out of all the fish that are out here, this is the one that you actually have to be the most careful of. Forget about sharks, forget about all the stuff that you see in the movies. These little guys live by cracking open oyster shells with their teeth. And so, if they're strong enough to crack an oyster shell, you try not to think about what they might be able to do to your fingers. Around the Anchor Road, we ran into another school of significant size. These are a little bit different. These are some of the usual damselfish that we see on the wrecks. And occasionally we would spot a wrasse. Those are those long, narrow fish. They look kind of like cigars making their way around. And they're very colorful. And they inhabit most of the wrecks in these areas. And of course, we found another toadfish back there, just staying in his shelter, not really wanting to be bothered by us, and probably not wanting that light right in his face. But he was worth looking at. They always are. There's a wrasse. I always think of these guys as the little clowns of these wrecks. Colorful, actually kind of playful. And you never know where they're going to pop out at you. One thing that you can always count on, though, is they'll be right around where there's a fair amount of coral. Not sure if they eat that, or if they just prefer that as part of their environment. The wreck itself has a lot of protrusions on it. This is something that you don't always find, although on artificial reefs it's fairly common. But if you're at a regular wreck, let's say like the Charleston tug, which is actually not too far from where this is, the structure is pretty much smooth. It looks literally like a ship. But in this case, things were all broken up, which is kind of nice from the standpoint of things growing on it. There's a lot more opportunity for things to attach in terms of corals and sponges, but it does occasionally become a bit of a problem if you get entangled with it, which is not that hard to do. The other thing that happens with that is the local fishermen, of course, like this area as well. It provides cover for fish, and so they know about this wreck. And you need to be careful watching for fishing line to get entangled with when you're down here, and always have a knife with you just in case. All of it's worth it, though, to be able to see something like this, these schools of fish that are around us, all the life. When I walk around at home, one of the things that I enjoy seeing are the birds in our backwoods. And sometimes in the spring and the fall, we have a number of migratory birds that make their way through. But it's nothing like this in terms of the sheer number. The largest flocks of birds don't even begin to compare with these schools of fish. If you look closely, you'll see some long, slender fish making their way through. They're called needlefish. The name's kind of obvious. I happened to run into one of these when I was in Florida not that long ago, or rather, he ran into me. These fish have the peculiar habit that they're attracted by bright lights, especially any kind of artificial light. And so if you're walking along the beach in Florida, for instance, and they see a flashlight or something like that, they'll come zipping right up at you. And in my case, I had one run right into the side of my foot and actually left a pretty decent gash. But it was interesting to see nonetheless. By the way, it wasn't one of the little ones that ran into my foot and created a gash. They couldn't do that if they tried. But when they reach 3 and 4 feet long, it's a whole different story. There were times when we were making our way over this wreck that there just simply wasn't that much to see. The murkiness sort of blotted a lot of things out. But every so often we'd come upon something interesting. Water might clear a little bit, and all of a sudden our visibility would be enough to pick up on something we hadn't seen previously. Or we were just lucky enough that we would run into something. Or someone in this case. If you're wondering, by the way, about that piece of line that you can see trailing along the edge of the wreck, that's something that usually gets put up by the dive master at the beginning of a dive. They'll go down and attach the actual anchor line, and then usually, especially in low visibility conditions, they'll run a line along the edge of the wreck just to give you something to be able to fixate on and guide your way along with if necessary.